It's a great pleasure for us to be here with you today. Thank you so much. We're going to jump in the deep end of the pool and really look forward to this conversation together. We'll do a tag team as the time goes along. We want to talk about developing a faith that's grounded in God's two books. You know, he wrote two books, right? The one you and I are familiar with, Scripture, and also the book of nature. Scripture itself says about nature, the heavens scream, they declare, they reveal the glory of God. The firmament proclaims his handiwork, and they're doing it day after day. Do we have eyes to see and ears to hear what God is speaking to us through creation? And 2 Timothy, speaking in particular about the Hebrew Bible, talks about the inspiration of Scripture. So we want to talk about a faith that's grounded in both of these books of God. And we're going to begin by talking about the faith of true prophets and the faith of false prophets. In the Old Testament, there are two kinds of false prophets. Type 1 false prophets are those that advocate going after some other god. The Old Testament doesn't actually take those folks very seriously. It tells a few stories about them, but then that we don't really have to worry about that because that's sort of a no-brainer. Far and away the more difficult type of false prophet is the one who speaks in the name of the Lord, a word the Lord has not spoken. That's what we call a type 2 false prophet. They believe in God, they believe in the God of Israel, and they say things, they make arguments. How do they make arguments? How do they believe they know what God's up to? Well, both the true and the false prophets, these are sort of the major components of the ideas that they work with when they construct a theological idea. They believe that God made the earth. They talk about the Abrahamic covenant, the Exodus and the conquest, the Mosaic covenant, Davidic covenant, the idea of the election, that God chose them, called them, the idea that God has been present with them. Emmanuel means God is with us. The notion that Jerusalem is God's holy city and Zion is God's holy mountain, the temple is God's holy house. That God is Israel's Savior and warrior. They have beliefs about the name of the Lord, its power, and the fact that it's invested. They have beliefs about God's character, especially in that passage in Exodus 34, when the Lord passes before Moses and proclaims his name, the Lord, a God merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. God's core values of justice and righteousness. So these are the materials from which you construct theological arguments, and both true and false prophets alike took this quiz, and they have to know this stuff if you're going to presumed to be a theologian in ancient Israel. The interesting thing is all these arguments sort of divide into three bins, so to speak. You can put them in three baskets. A number of them, as a matter of fact, far and away the majority, sort of cluster together under what we're going to call today salvation theology. Salvation theology are all those theological ideas that lead in one way or another to the notion that God is saving us, delivering us, protecting us, making covenants with us, getting us to heaven, all that kind of stuff. But there are other ideas that, in specific, the notion of the character and values of God represent sort of another category of ideas from which we make theological cases and arguments. And then standing sort of off by itself is a theology of creation, sui generis, a sort of category unto itself. And the interesting thing is to see how it is that true prophets and false prophets built their theological system. So when you take for instance, and kind of summarize all those places in the Old Testament where the type 2 false prophets are given lines, that is, where their actual comments are recorded, you can reconstruct their theological position. It goes something like this. The opponents of the prophets, those type 2 false prophets, say time and time again that God's not going to allow evil, sword, or famine to overtake Israel. They believe instead that peace is on the horizon. In fact, they demand peace from God because he is in their midst. See the Emmanuel theology? They don't believe that God would give them over into the hand of the Babylonians. They consider it a treason that Jeremiah would say that God is going to. God is going to reverse all the bad things that have happened and turn them around for good. They cite God's promises to Abraham, that's the Abrahamic covenant, as proof that they're going to maintain possession of the land. They claim to know God in a special way. They revel in the fact that the very temple of the Lord is in their midst. They believe this is a sign of God's presence and their security. They find it utterly impossible that God would reject Judah or allow anything to happen to Jerusalem, in part because a Davidic king sits on the throne. They rejoice that they are the recipients of the Torah of God. They believe that the Torah has made them wise. Even though they have sinned against God, they look to God to be their Savior and deliverer. They understand themselves to be called by the name of the Lord and blessed by him with prophets in their midst, even in exile. Anything wrong with that? Say, that sounds like pretty good stuff. Isn't that standing on the promises of God? Interesting thing, when you step back and look at it, you discover that the type 2 false prophets have built a theological system that's grounded exclusively on salvation theology. Now, some of you are going to leave this place and say, that Del Martyr, he was telling us that salvation theology is bad stuff. Completely wrong. I'm not going to say that at all. But I am going to say that salvation theology disconnected from character and core values of God and a theology of creation leads to something very bad very quick. So you never hear out of these type 2 false prophets them talking about the character of mercy of God and the core values of justice and righteousness, and you don't hear them talking about creation theology. Theology, according to type 2 false prophets, is all about a small God with a small agenda. Saving me, delivering me, protecting me, fighting my battles for me, staying with me through thick and thin, walking beside me, proving me right, making me prosperous, ultimately getting me to heaven, etc. It's all about me. The problem with this is that a worldview that's steeped only in salvation theology transformed God into a self-serving lapdog and has no sense of the larger agenda that God is up to, no real moral compass to know how the heart of God operates. And in the end, it's not just a theological boo-boo, it's nothing other than false prophecy, causing people to believe a lie about God and what God is up to in the world. Very, very serious, sobering thought. So the true prophets get it right. They have, so we could spend a lot of time talking about character and core values, but it's remarkable the theology of creation that they carry to these theological discussions. It gives them a bigger perspective. Now, I've flashed Genesis 1 up here. I'm not going to read it. I'm assuming you've all read it once or twice before. I'm just going to make a few observations. First of all, the creation account is not a process going from nothing to something. It's a process going from chaos to order. In the beginning, creation was watery, void, formless, and void. Darkness covered everything. God is going to go through a process to order creation. He does it through separating things out. So we see he separates light from darkness, separates the waters above, the waters below, pulls together the dry land, separates day from night. What's he doing here in this separating? He refines in various ways, and he even calls creation itself into the creative process. Let the earth bring forth vegetation. Let the waters swarm with creatures. Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind. And in doing so, he is ordering the chaos into spatial domains. So what, after you separate all the stuff out, what have you got? Sky, dry ground, and the waters, the seas. And the vision, and also in terms of time, time does not just go tick, 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 tick in a straight line on to eternity. Rather, time is ordered into cycles that are themselves set apart, sanctified for special purposes. And we have days, and especially the 6-1 cycle, as well as months and years, and even lights in the sky to signal those cycles and their importance. Each spatial domain is to be filled with the life appropriate to it. What does that mean? There's birds of the, fish of the, animals of the, beasts of the field, and so on. This is God's vision for life in this. And each temporal domain has a meaning, especially that 6-1 cycle that culminates in the Sabbath. So theology of creation, this is, we could talk for days actually about theology of creation, just giving a few little sketches here. It's a notion, first of all, in terms of space, that it's not just dirt and air and water. These are domains that have been sanctified by God, set aside by God for a special purpose, separated domains. And there's a life for each domain, and each domain is to be teeming with the life appropriate to it. The same is true of time. Time is not just seconds going from here to eternity. It's cycles that have been set aside to receive the patterns of our life and living in relationship with one another and with God. What do humans bring to this sanctified space and sanctified time? The call to humans is to bring sanctified behavior. What's sanctified behavior? Behavior that's synchronized to the character and core values of God. We take on God's heart of mercy. We take on his work in justice and righteousness. And that's when that happens, this is where a deep shalom, not the shallow shalom of the type 2 false prophets, but a deep shalom of the true prophets, a synchronicity, a harmony between human beings in harmony with God's intentions for the created order. This is a deep and powerful set of ideas, many of them bordering on what we in the modern world would call mystical, but they are a fundamental part. So the true prophets get it right because they hold in tension salvation theology with theology of the character of God and creation theology. And that's what a solid faith system is built on. It's not collapsed all into, doesn't have all of our eggs just in salvation theology, as marvelous as that is. But when you do that, what do you end up with? False prophecy, because it degenerates very quickly into something self-serving. True prophets keep this stuff in proper tension. False prophets get it wrong because they would pass off salvation theology as the whole of theology. So it turns out that the type 2 false prophets are continuously getting blindsided. And who are they getting blindsided by? Reality. They're getting blindsided by history. They're getting blindsided by the work of God in the world. They say, wait a minute, we're theologians. We've read the Bible. We're standing on the promises of God. Why are we getting blindsided all these times? We'd like to talk about this. Is it possible? Can our faith get blindsided? What does it look like when that happens? What does it feel like? What do we do when this happens? What does it tell us about how we're holding our beliefs? So we're going to take 3 little case studies right now. We're going to jump into the deep end of the pool. Let me tell you right off the bat, these are challenging ideas that are facing the church and people of faith in the world today. And they're stretching us right to the max. In some cases, they seem to be completely blindsiding the community of faith. And we want to just raise some issues and ask some questions and see if together we can discern God's leadership in these present days. First one we want to talk about is the relationship of human life to other life. So a typical Christian worldview goes something like this. There's God, and right up next to God, made in the image of God, given a special place in the created order by God, is humans. So there's God, there's humans, and then there's this great big gap between human life, and way, way down, quite a ways below it, then is all the rest of life on planet Earth. And then along comes reality. Beth, you're on.
So the way this works is he gets to talk about the Bible, and then I get to cause trouble. So actually, my brother told me I should tell you at the end that I don't have time for questions, but my dad will take care of all your questions. So I can give you his phone number. So this is a picture of Francis Collins. So Francis Collins, many of you probably heard of him. He was at the University of Michigan for a number of years. He's a physician and scientist, and was director of the Human Genome Project and is now director of NIH. A number of years ago, he wrote this book called The Language of God. So as a geneticist, it's a really interesting book. I recommend that you read it if you haven't read it. And his point is he would call DNA the language of God, okay? And part of how he came up with that concept is that, in fact, DNA is the alphabet, the grammar, the language that underlies all of life on this planet. Plant life, animal life, our lives. DNA is a shared language of life. Now, what is DNA? So those of you who are in chemistry and biology should know this. Those of you, this is a good liberal arts education here. We're covering all the bases. So DNA is actually a set of chemicals. So DNA is actually a chemical polymer. And so the point of this is just so that you see that it's fundamentally chemistry. carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and I think people hear about DNA and genes and don't understand that really it's a bunch of chemicals. So DNA is this language, and then your cells can read these strings of bases, which are really sort of letters of an alphabet, and from that make proteins. And proteins really are the basis of life. I mean, you are made of a bunch of proteins stuck together in different ways. And that's kind of how life works. So one of the things that's happened, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years, is a huge advancement in our ability to read this language. So to take the DNA from a human or any other species and run it through a machine and read every letter in that alphabet. And I mean, I spent a year of my life as a graduate student trying to read 2,000 bases of this one thing I was trying to clone. I mean, I think about this now. I mean, now these sequencers can do like 1 million bases in a minute, I mean, it's really kind of disgusting. But so we've got this explosion in, first of all, our ability to read these sequences, and second, the capacity and kind of all the computer and informatics people have come up with all these ways now to look at this information, because it's a huge information problem. You have billions of letters in the alphabet, and what do you do with that? So one of the things that we've learned now that we can sequence DNA from all these different animals is we've learned that there's quite similar. So the very top, can I get a thing? Okay, so if you see the very top line here, it's a little bit hard to see. That is the human gene for this pyruvate kinase. It's not really important what pyruvate kinase is. You could do a similar thing for just about any random gene you want to look at, and you'd see something very similar. So the human gene's on the top, and what they've done is basically color-coded. Here we have a rhesus macaque, which is one species of monkey, a dog, a mouse, a chicken, and a zebrafish. And every one of these animals has a gene for pyruvate kinase. And so if you line these genes up, what you see here is in the human gene, this little light blue section is kind of where all the on-off switches are. All the information that tells a cell when it's going to turn this gene on or not to actually make the protein. The little blue pieces here, the little boxes, are the parts of the DNA that are actually the directions for making the actual protein. And then there's these intervening sequences that are sort of filler, you could think of them as. And what you see here is that these lines are showing where the higher this line is, the more similar the sequence of the DNA in these animals, that if the line's high, it's very similar sequence to human. So what you see in the monkey is even the on-off switches are very much the same. All the way across, even the intervening regions that are just filler are very similar. And these areas in blue that code for the protein are almost identical. So the top line here would be 100% identity. Similarly, other mammals, the dog and mouse, the areas that actually code for the protein are very much the same in the dog and the mouse. And I mean, you can take any random mouse version of a gene, throw it in a human cell, and it'll make a protein, a mouse version of the protein that'll work perfectly fine. Little bit less similarity in the chicken and zebrafish, but still very clearly a lot of similarity. Now, if one maps human chromosomes, so this is a little map of all the chromosomes in a human, every spot on here that's colored is a spot where there's not only the same gene in a mouse genome, but several genes in the same order on a mouse chromosome matching what you would see in the human. So people have used comparative genomics to make models about how life is connected and where different species have branched off over time. Now, some of you are probably starting to get really tweaked and want the Bible guy to come back. And you're saying, well, but you can't really do that experiment. How do you know this is not just some bogus nonsense that some math people made up these models, and you can make these trees, and so they sort of match fossils, but really you can't do the experiment to show that this way of comparing genomes really works. And you're totally right. So what I want to do is just mess with you a little bit more and talk about the genetics of hypertension. So this guy, Richard Lifton, was in Portland a couple weeks ago and gave a talk. And he's at Yale, and he's been working, he's a geneticist. And so for a couple of decades now, they've been looking at extremes in blood pressure. And they've identified, screening people all over the world, things in red, so mutations that raise blood pressure, or in blue, whoops, mutations that lower blood pressure. And so, you know, he's a geneticist. So he said, you know, I think we can use this comparative genomic stuff that all these folks have developed for these other uses. We ought to be able to use that to look at these really rare mutations in people and predict how many people are carriers of these genes in a general population. And so that's what they did. They used comparative genomics, the same models, the same math that people have used to compare across species, to ask how frequently will these very rare mutations show up in a human population. And so they looked particularly at a couple of different syndromes that were 1 in 20 million or 1 in a million, or I mean 20 in a million or 1 in a million, that are mutations in a couple of different transporters in the kidney. Turns out everything that really, really messes up blood pressure affects salt handling in the kidney. And so they did all these calculations, and they predicted that 1% of the general population would be carriers of these genes. And so they sequenced 10,000 genomes from the people in the Framingham Heart Study, this town in Massachusetts, and they found exactly their predicted frequency in that population. And they also found that the carriers, the 1% of people that carried one copy of these mutations, had lower blood pressure than their siblings and never developed high blood pressure. Now, the point of this is just to say that the same genomics that makes us so uncomfortable when we look across species is what's revolutionizing medicine when we compare across human populations. It's the same stuff. And so I think, you know, we need to look at it either works or it doesn't, and it raises some really uncomfortable questions. So if DNA is the language of life, the language of God, and our biology and chemistry and the way our bodies work and many of our parts are interchangeable with other animals, and the DNA suggests, it's not the only thing, but it suggests we were created through processes that generated other forms of life, and that we maybe possibly share ancestry with other forms of life, then that raises a lot of really uncomfortable questions. I mean, this is, you know, we've always learned we're created in the image of God. We are fundamentally different, that we have this privileged position, and that Christ died for us, and that, you know, we're special. And I don't want to imply that any of this is not true, because it is. I would suggest maybe these are not mutually exclusive things, that maybe God can work in ways that we don't fully understand. So here's just a few questions that we came up with that are raised for us by this. So if the book of creation suggests that we were created through a process that also has generated other forms of life, why does this offend us? Because, I mean, I think for most of us, it really fundamentally feels very offensive. And so I think it's an interesting question to ask, why are we so offended by this? If our theology says we're creatures, right? We're not God. And so another question that we would raise is, do we really think we're more like God than we are? I mean, we still kind of prey to this temptation that, we have the knowledge of good and evil, we can become like God. And is it possible that part of our problem with this whole idea is that it puts us in our place? That we are part of the created order. We're not God. We're connected to the rest of life on earth. Just some questions.
Well, if that's not enough, let's throw another one at us here. Size and age of the universe. Typical Christian worldview, we find ourselves thrown into the world. We're just like a person, a guy, a girl, a man or woman. And we're just living our life out. And we're a little person on a big planet. And then we hear the good news of God's reality and God's work in our world. And we discover this grand story that stretches from creation to consummation, and this marvelous stretch of history, Germans call it Heilsgeschichte, salvation history, in which God has been working. We can trace that history for 5,000 years through the Old Testament, through the work of Christ in the New Testament, through church history, right on up to Spring Arbor Free Methodist Church this very day. It all points right to us. And it is part of the ministry of the gospel to help individuals find themselves in that story. That our life finds meaning when we find ourselves caught up in that story, redeemed by that story, seen to be a part of God's story. And if this is part of the message of the gospel. It's part of the work of discipleship, helping people to understand that it's not about us so much as it is about God and the work of God and our place within that work in the world. If you've never come to this realization, I pray that the Spirit works in your life to bring you to that realization. But now, here's how we get blindsided. What happens as our world, as we move out away in rocket ships and satellites and look back on planet Earth and see it among the other planets, and it begins to fade ever smaller before us. 98.5% of everything in our solar system is the sun, and half of what's left is Jupiter. So we're just a tiny little speck with even just our solar system. Our solar system, 93 million miles from here to the sun. That's our new astronomical unit, our measuring stick for measurements within our solar system. And it seems gigantic, 93 million miles. There we are. We're point number 1, the third planet, third rock from the sun. Jupiter, 6 astronomical units. Saturn, 9. Get out there to poor Pluto that used to be a planet. 39.5 astronomical units. We're not even halfway to the end of our solar system. We've got the Kuiper Belt and the Oort cloud. So we get 100 astronomical units from the sun out to the heliosphere that sort of defines our solar system. And here we are traveling faster than the speed of light, because if you had the pedal to the metal and entered the solar system from one side of the heliosphere traveling at the speed of light, it'd take you 12 hours to get to the sun. And another 12 hours to get across to the other side of the heliosphere and leave our solar system. One light day traveling at the speed of light to get across our solar system. How long if you kept the pedal to the metal and kept going until you arrived at the next nearest star? Some of you know this number? 4.2 light years. You'd have to keep it up at the speed of light before you get to Alpha Centauri. Now, so just to think here for a minute, if the good news of Christ dying on the cross, saying it is finished, if that started to get broadcast right at the moment that it happened, it would take a day to reach to the end, or half a day to reach to the end of our solar system. It would take 4.2 years to arrive at Alpha Centauri, the next nearest star. As we keep going out here, these are the stars within 50 light years. So 50 years after the time of the resurrection, or Crucifixion of Christ, the news has made it out to these planets, or these suns, these other solar systems nearby to us, about 1,400 star systems. Keep going out, and now we're at 5,000 light years. So the 5,000 years of salvation history now, and traveling at the speed of light, the good news of Christ has reached out to this part of, well, where are we headed here? You can see our solar system. 100,000 light years from one side to the other. How far from one side of our solar system to the other? One light day. Our solar system, our galaxy, 100,000 light years, which means that the gospel of Christ, traveling at the speed of light, has covered about this much of our galaxy to this point, and has yet to make it into sort of the rest of the galaxy, let alone to the Andromeda galaxy, our local cluster of galaxies, us and Andromeda, the big one. We're the second biggest one, and 50 or 60 small companion galaxies in this area. 100,000 light years across our solar system, 3.2 million light years off to Andromeda galaxy. It'll be 3.1.995,000 years before the good news of Christ makes it to the Andromeda galaxy. This just keeps getting crazier and crazier. There's our little local cluster. There's other clusters, and we're talking about now 5 million light years. All of us are being dragged off in the direction of the Virgo galaxy, 150 million light years in that direction someplace, apparently headed for some sort of a meeting that's important for us to get to. And astronomers have sort of done the models, and here's how it's going to play out. Be scary if that was going to happen next week, but these are things that are going to happen across very, very long time frames. You can keep going up and up and up. And planet Earth and all of its history becomes a tinier and tinier and tinier speck in the grandiosity of a universe that seems to be 13.7 billion light years in size. One way to look at it is if you take a speck of sand, a grain of sand between your thumb and your forefinger, and hold it up to the night sky and cover a part of the night sky. Hubble focuses on that little speck of sky, and for 70 hours opens its aperture, sees if there's anything there. And when they do the film, here's what you end up with. This picture right here. Every one of those is a galaxy. 1,000 galaxies behind a grain of sand. And if you move that one width of grain to the right, you just uncovered that 1,000 galaxies and covered up another 1,000 galaxies. The universe is way bigger than it has any right to be. And if the only thing if the only thing we know is salvation theology, do you see what just happened? The earth and all of its history, including the mighty acts of God, just disappeared into a speck so insignificantly small that we lost our faith in a certain way of thinking, right? Our faith has to be, if we only know salvation theology, doesn't God's work on earth disappear into a tiny speck? Do we think that the universe is all about us and it's only here for us? What does it do to our faith to discover that God is up to things that reach way above and way beyond his work on the earth? Is our understanding of God's creation big enough, or is a theological system built only on salvation theology completely blindsided by these sorts of things? Well, a third and final one here. We haven't jumped far enough into the deep end of the pool. Here's another one, the nature of sex. A typical Christian worldview makes perfect sense to think that there's sort of God created males and females. In the image of God created he them. And we've got two nice bell-shaped curves, tight curves so that there's men and women. And we're really even a little uncomfortable with drawing the curves like this. And the closer we get into here, we sort of get uncomfortable and start to make fun of girly men and manly women, because we like these nice clean categories of male and female. So depending on your view of how these things go, it's really a challenge to discover that these bell-shaped curves overlap. Beth, take it. She gets the hard stuff.
Yeah, I get to do all the really things. So, so I'm going to blame Hessel for some of this. Now, some of the information on the next slides I completely stole from a presentation done several years ago by this guy who's a professor at Calvin, but I've updated some of the statistics. So biologists, so to start out with, you know, when a baby's born, one of my grad students just had a baby, so you have 3 questions. You know, is it a boy or girl? What's their name? And are they healthy? Because sex is fundamental to our identity and to our human nature. And for some newborns, sexual identification is ambiguous. And this is actually far more common than most people understand. So biologists talk about sex and gender as being 2 different things. So sex is biology, and gender is, includes kind of more fuzzy things like femininity and masculinity that can have all kinds of definitions. But when you're talking about sex, you're talking about chromosomes, XX, XY, or there's actually all kinds of variation. And it's interestingly, by far, the most frequent chromosomal abnormalities are in the sex chromosomes. So much more frequently, 1 in 1,000 births that have some variation of altered frequency of X and Y chromosomes. It's far more frequent than any other thing that you've heard of, like Down syndrome, trisomy 21, things like that. And so there's obvious external and internal genitalia, and sometimes those are ambiguous. Sometimes external genitalia and internal genitalia don't match. So you have kind of some of everything. And then obviously, in addition to genetics and chromosomes, hormones are particularly important during development in terms of setting up the biology of sex. So we have this, you know, concept of these 2 separate things. But in reality, biology is not that clean. So there's an overlap, and there are a number of different things that can cause someone to be intersex, which is to say some characteristics of male sex and female sex, it would be the most common definition of that, can be caused by a lot of different things. A few of them are on this table. So at the top you see chromosomal changes, androgen insensitivity, which we'll very briefly look at. That's fairly common. Adrenal hyperplasia, so the adrenal gland makes adrenaline or epinephrine, but part of the adrenal gland also makes androgens, and so adrenal tumors can cause things. So there's a variety of things, and in general, it's estimated that about 1.7% of people are intersex. So one of the fairly common things is androgen insensitivity, and depending on the exact cause, this can be complete to very mild. So it's in this syndrome, somebody is going to be genetically XY, so genetically male, but usually has female genitalia, can depend the degree on the exact mutation. So this is caused by a mutation in the androgen receptor. So androgens are things you've heard of before, testosterone being the most famous. Dihydrotestosterone is a modified form of testosterone that actually does a whole lot of what we think of as being testosterone effects. A lot of that's actually done by dihydrotestosterone. And the way these things work is by binding to a receptor. And then the receptor does things, and that's how they work. Well, if the receptor doesn't work, then you can have all the testosterone in the world, and your body will not respond to it. And so in this syndrome, most of the time, the receptor doesn't work. Now, when Hessel-Baume first put this together in 2004, there were 58 mutations identified. So they just updated this, and so I pulled this up last week. The most recent update on the androgen receptor mutations database has now over 500 different androgen receptor mutations from more than 850 patients. So this is a map of the androgen receptor gene. And basically, the point of this is that every single one of these lines coming off of this with some little combination of letters and numbers is a distinct mutation that's been identified in someone. And the mutations in the red area tend to cause prostate cancer, and mutations in the bluish areas cause various degrees of androgen insensitivity, depending on whether in some spots the receptor becomes completely non-functional, in other spots it's partially functional. So the point here being that there's a lot of ways things can go wrong. So here are just a few questions that are raised for us by just this whole idea of intersexuality. One is God more comfortable with variety than we are? Steve already mentioned, I mean, we tend to look at people differently depending on kind of where they are on that curve, sort of masculinity, femininity, or whatever. And so, you know, we want to raise a question, do you think that God views people differently depending on where they are? And, you know, if 1.5% of the population is dealing with this, I mean, every day in an academic medical center, somebody's born with these conditions. Some teenagers getting diagnosed and learning, oh, you didn't have your period because you don't have a uterus. Somebody's learning that they can't have a baby because they didn't have a uterus. And yet, I've been in the church my whole life. I never heard of this before I got to a medical center. And so one question is, are churches and communities safe places for people to be honest about who they are, how they were born, how they were created? And final point is to be human and be anywhere on the bell-shaped curve is to be a child of God.
So I've been learning that creation has a lot of surprises for us. Things are just not always as we expect them to be. The universe is bigger than we had any idea. The mysteries of God's creation are deeper than we had any idea. And we find our creation, theology of creation does this to us, and that's why it's so important to have it as a part of your theological system. It humbles us. It makes us realize our place. It decenters us. It says to us, you're not the center of the universe. It ain't all about you. God is up to stuff on orders of magnitude so far above us that we can't comprehend it. And it's so at orders of magnitude so far below us in the inner workings of DNA and further lower than that, that we have no idea what's going on. The power of creation theology is it reminds us of our finitude. It shows us our place and the limitations of our place. It decenters us. It deflates our arrogance. It gives us a bigger God who's up to more things. It drives us to salvation theology with a new humility. Science is the exploration of God's book of creation. And for those of you that are thinking about in this area, I just want to say to you, go for it. Go for it. God is inviting you to figure it out as an act of worship with your life energies. And that's every bit as legitimate as going to seminary, going to the mission field, doing this. Because it's not just to figure it out. Even more, it's to use what we learn in service of God's character, mercy, and his core values of justice and righteousness. He calls us not just to knowledge, but to wisdom and goodness. And that takes both of these things. Creation humbles us. This is exactly where we need to be when we receive the good news of salvation. Big God, big history. Thank you so much for your time.
We're pushing the clock real close here. But before we run out, we probably could take one question as long as we get a reasonably short answer. But so I don't... But do we have a question? Somebody's got something right on the end of their lips. Michael.
Steve, Beth, first of all, thank you. Wonderful presentation. In 2 Peter 3, after ranting on about false teachers for a whole chapter in 2 Peter 2, Peter goes back not just to the beginning, but also to the end. And he talks about false prophets, scoffers coming, scoffing and following their own evil desires. And then he says, they will say, where is the coming he promised? And after talking about, well, things just, look, they just go on, he then goes right back to creation. So it seems to me that getting it right, so to speak, at the beginning also means getting it right at the end. And that we also say in the Old Testament, the great and terrible day of the Lord. And while that doesn't get a lot of play necessarily with this tension between true and false prophets, it does in the New Testament. Could you comment on that as well?
Amen. Yeah. I don't. You have a. I don't mean to slight that. I think that's totally right on. And it's another illustration of the importance of a faith system that's built not only on salvation theology, as good as all of that is, but that's held in proper tension with a theology of creation and the character and core values of God.
Well, thank you again for coming. And if you have questions, you're welcome to hang around here and continue to chat for a while. Hope to see you in 2 weeks.